Carol, next, please.
Jill?
Yeah.
Hi, Jill. Nice to meet you.
David.
Nice to meet you, David. Nice to meet you. Nice shirt.
Thanks, it's my favorite.
What makes you qualified for this position? Tell me why you'd like to work for this company.
That's a toughie.
I don't really know why.
Because you're hiring.
Tell me about your biggest career accomplishment.
Obviously, I don't have any.
I don't know why you need to know that.
Tell me how you handle stress.
Dude!
I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable.
Thanks so much for coming in.
Wonderful. When do I start?
Okay, I think we're done.
Last week, we kicked this series off called Prepared because a lot of us feel like we sit in that room on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes we have coffee with a friend or we have Thanksgiving with a family member and they throw some kind of faith grenade at us and it lands in our lap and we're not entirely sure what to do with it. And you feel the pressure of there's not a whole lot of time right now and it seems like they're not really interested in the answers that I might provide. They just kind of want to mess with me and then move on to the next thing. And so last week we talked about how do we respond in those moments. And the goal of our series is really to kind of give you one-liners that you can reply to some of those jabs with, some one-liners that just bring a lot of clarity and pull out of the complexity of all that we believe, some real just kind of straight answers to some of those things. And so last week we started with, and it's kind of the genesis of this entire discussion, we started with what Peter said. Peter's kind of encouragement to us to be ready to talk about what it is we believe, to be ready to talk about our hope. This is what he said. He wrote it down for us so that we would never ever forget. If someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. And what we found so interesting last week is he doesn't say be ready to answer every question. That's the number one reason people say, well, I don't bring up my faith at work because they're going to ask me a question that I don't know the answer to, and so it's better just not to answer any of their questions. That makes good sense, right? Somehow in our brain, I'm just going to ignore all their questions because I may not be able to answer every question. I'm so thankful that he says, be prepared to give an answer for all the other Christians in the world. I don't know if you've met other Christians, but they can be kind of a problem for making our job, our mission, really, really difficult because some people just are not gentle. We talked about like the way we do this should be gentle and kind and respectful. That's what Peter said, at least. He doesn't even say you should be ready to give an answer for your church. I say this all the time, like, church people are weird, and I'm okay with that. I'm one of them. I'm like first in line church people. Let's just embrace that and let people know we're down to earth and we're in touch enough to realize it is a little different that we gather together all in the same room and we sing songs together. Like, where else do we do that? Except a concert, right? Like, we sing these songs together. It's complicated, and it's weird to explain, but Peter says you don't need to worry about being ready to explain all of that. You just need to be ready to explain your hope. Your hope. In other words, why you personally have decided to follow Jesus. Why is that how you've oriented your life all of a sudden? And what Peter did, and what I believe we should do, every Christian should do, is he anchored his hope in the answer to why have I begun following Jesus to the resurrection. The resurrection provides the anchor for the entire discussion. It's the moment that changed everything. So let's start there. Let's get it to that discussion as quickly as we possibly can. Our goal is to get it to Jesus as fast as we can. And so over and over again, we watched Peter tie it back to our hope is because Jesus rose from the dead. And remember what Paul said? Paul said, if Jesus didn't come back from the dead, then your faith, do you remember the word he used? Is useless. The Christian faith and the Christian preachers and the Christian churches, They are all an utter waste of time if Jesus didn't come back from the dead. Now, if Paul and Peter put that kind of emphasis on the resurrection, don't you think we all should? We should all anchor our faith and our discussion about why we follow Jesus, why he is our hope to the resurrection. So we came up with this one simple phrase that we would respond to that to, and it goes like this: I believe Jesus died for my sins and rose from the dead. Simple, right? It's not complex. It's really clear. I believe Jesus died for my sin, my wrongdoing. And notice what we're not saying. We're not even going to talk about their sin yet. We're just going to talk about our own. Jesus died for my sin, and he rose from the dead. Now, your friends and your family members are really smart. They're really smart people. And by the way, make sure they know that you believe that, and not in a passive-aggressive kind of way. The people that don't believe what you believe are not dumb people. They're really intelligent, and that's part of respecting them that Peter talked about. Let's respect their intelligence. And one of the ways they're going to prove to you that they're intelligent is they're going to go, okay, that's great, but why? Why do you believe that? Because we all read the Harvard Business Review that told us Toyota does the 5 whys, and if you ask a problem 5 why questions, you're eventually going to get to the answer. So they're going to do like a little 5-year-old, and they're going to go, yeah, but why? So you believe Jesus died for your sins and he rose again? Why? And our answer is, I believe Jesus died for my sins and rose again. And then most of us say, because the Bible told me so. Right? Because even if you didn't grow up in church, you sang this song. See if you can sing it along. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the... Yeah, they beat that into you, right? I mean, your Sunday school teacher was well-intentioned, but that is the response that we have to everything, because the Bible told me so. And right there, in that moment, as soon as we utter those words, we get ourselves in trouble. Because one of the first things that people will push back on is the Bible. And why we believe what the Bible says, that was written by 40-some different authors at all kinds of different periods in time. And they have all kinds of questions, and there's no archaeological proof for this, that, or the other thing. And all of a sudden, now we are in that place where we're sitting across from the interviewer going, I'm not prepared. And we were taught that the foundation of our faith is the Bible. That the reason we believe what we believe, the reason we come to church, the reason we do what we do is because of the Bible, as if the Bible came down from heaven, whole and wrapped and stamped and ready to go with our name on it. And then we get into high school, and we graduate high school, and we go to college, and some things start getting thrown at us because not everybody believes that it's that simple. Not everybody believes that it's that easy, and they won't let you off the hook. You've been here where your family or your friends go, can we talk about the Bible, like honestly and objectively? Because they probably took a class with a professor that says things like this professor says, properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism ever conceived. In other words, there are people in your life, there are people in my life and in our neighborhoods who say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe Jesus because I don't buy the Bible. And so when we come at them and we're trying to convince them the hope that we have, and we throw the Bible at them, right away they hit the brakes. And so it's just my personal conviction that we've got to talk about the Bible differently. It's my personal conviction. I'm not saying it's got to be yours. It's just mine. That because of what Peter says about anchoring our faith to the resurrection, then the foundation of my faith is not the Bible. It's the empty tomb. And the Bible tells me about the empty tomb, and it's important, so please, but I'm going to say this about 5 times today. I'm not saying the Bible doesn't matter. Okay? Like, say that in your head. Josh has not said the Bible doesn't matter. He's not saying that the Bible isn't inspired. He's not saying that the Bible isn't inerrant. I'm just saying as we have conversations and we find ourselves in those situations, the way by which we talk about what we believe and why we believe what we believe needs to be a little bit different. And so I want to kind of give you the framework, and we're going to go fast through a lot of stuff. So if you've got a pen or paper, take notes, or if you want to take pictures of the slides, I'll make sure I smile and give a thumbs up whenever you do it, and then you can have notes to go back and review as we go. But I want to start in the Old Testament, and I want to start in the Old Testament because everybody starts in the Old Testament. Like I said last week, most of your friends and family they're not going to throw a swing at Jesus. They're going to throw a swing at Jonah and Noah and Daniel and all of these stories that they've heard or were sitting in a Sunday school class when they were young and they heard, and they're going, that's really difficult for me to believe. That's really difficult for me to buy into. And here's my response oftentimes when people go, do you really buy that? I go, yeah, I buy that because Jesus bought it. I believe the Old Testament is true and good and something that I need to be regularly consuming because Jesus talked about the Old Testament all of the time. In fact, it was his favorite reference material. Over and over again, he cites his teaching and bases it in the Old Testament. So if Jesus took it seriously, and Jesus is the center and the foundation of everything that I believe, then, and we've said this before, right? If someone can predict their own death and resurrection and then pull it off to the letter, I'm going to go with whatever they say. And Jesus said the Old Testament a lot. In fact, one of the times, Matthew wrote this down when Jesus was talking about it. It's part of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's Matthew 5. Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the Torah, the first 5 books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. When Jesus says, or any time you hear the phrase law of Moses, they're talking about the Torah. So the first 5 books. And Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish what Moses wrote down, what God gave Moses to put on the tablets, or the 600 plus other laws. I'm not really doing away with those, or the writings of the prophets. So Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah, Malachi, some of those crazy names that are at the end, or for us, like in the middle of your Bible, where you're like, I don't know if I can read that because I don't know how I can pronounce that name. Jesus says, listen, those prophets, we're not doing away with them. They still matter. They're still really important. Don't misunderstand why I've come. It's not to put an end to that. It's to accomplish their purpose. And we could spend a whole series talking about what Jesus is saying right there, that I didn't come to abolish them. I came to accomplish them or complete them or fulfill them, depending on what translation of the scriptures that you're reading. But Jesus did not come to diss or dismiss the Old Testament. And so that's just my quick response all the time is, well, Jesus talked about it, so it must be important, and Jesus is important to me, so I'm going to believe what Jesus said, and I'm going to look at the things that Jesus read. I'm just going to do that. And again, you can see what I'm doing. I'm quickly bringing it back to Jesus. And we can talk all day. We can even admit to them, it's okay. It's okay to acknowledge the tension. It's okay. It doesn't mean that you don't believe it. It's okay for you to go, hey, I know there's some crazy stuff in there. Like if you've ever read the book of Judges, there's some intense moments of battle. It's like Braveheart stuff, right? Like there's just some weird things, and it's okay for us to say, I don't even know that I've got the answer for everything, but here's what I know. Jesus talked about the Old Testament, and he said he didn't come to diss or dismiss it. So I'm not dissing or dismissing it. I'm gonna go with what it says. And think about this. What's more compelling to you, even as a Christian? What's more compelling to you? I believe the story of Adam and Eve because it's in the Bible, or I believe the story of Adam and Eve because Jesus did. This is why you buy things on Amazon. Do you know that? You buy things on Amazon not because Amazon tells you that they're great, but because a friend told you that they're great. Or people that you don't even know gave it a certain number of stars. You go, I'm going to buy that thing because it got 4.5 stars by 1,000 people, so it must be good. So why would we go a different route? If Jesus believed Adam and Eve, then I believe Adam and Eve because Jesus did what he did, and I'm going with whatever he said. And you might have some really smart, intelligent people look at you and go, you're talking like an 8-year-old. You know what my response is? Well, Jesus said have faith like a child, so I'm just doing what Jesus told me to do. Is it overly simple? Yeah. But is it logical? Yeah. It starts to make sense, and it roots the whole thing in Jesus. And why do I believe Jesus? Because he rose from the dead. Because the resurrection happened. And we'll get there in a minute. But this is so important because, again, most people are not going to want to talk about bad things about Jesus. Even people of other faith traditions are cool with Jesus. Most people are going to want to throw jabs at the Old Testament. Now, the college professors, they're not going to tell you that you sound like an 8-year-old. They're going to tell you that you are using a logical fallacy. In other words, circular reasoning. And this is why they say you can't use circular reasoning. Because if all we know about what Jesus said is in the Bible, and you're saying that you believe what the Bible says because Jesus said what he said about the Bible, but Jesus' words are in the Bible, then you're using the Bible to prove the Bible. And you can't do that. Right? So I can't use the New Testament to prove the Old Testament, and I can't use the Old Testament to prove the New Testament because they're all part of one book. And you can't use the same book. And right there is where we just need to educate ourselves a little bit to help turn that discussion. The issue is somebody decided to call it the Bible. And the word Bible is a Latin word that comes from a Greek word that means book. Bible means book. And so when we talk about it, we're saying it's one book. And it is one book in that it all came from, ultimately, the same author, comes from God's heart, right? That's what Paul told Timothy. It's all God-breathed, right? So in that way, yes, it's one. But it's better than a book. It's actually a collection. It's a collection of ancient manuscripts that were around for a very long time before the Bible was the Bible. I don't know if you ever have thought about that. But all of the Old Testament, or the Jewish Bible, or the Jewish scriptures, existed before the Bible. And what Matthew wrote, and Mark wrote, and Luke wrote, and John wrote, were all in existence before the Bible was in existence. Paul's letters, Peter's letters, all of their letters, John's letters, all existed and were in circulation before the Bible. The Bible didn't become the Bible until 300 years later. And so what someone did, thank the good Lord, is took all of that and collected it into one collection. And they got included because they were considered reliable. So this is how I start talking about the New Testament, particularly the gospel writers. We have to stop thinking that they matter or they're reliable just because they're in the Bible. They matter and they're reliable, so they got included in the Bible. We put it this way: the Gospels were considered reliable enough to be included. Because there are ancient writings from the same time period that even mention Jesus that weren't included because they weren't considered reliable enough. And so when we talk about the Gospels, nobody sat down and decided, I'm going to write the Bible. Matthew sat down and he wrote, I'm going to write the biography of Jesus. And Luke decided, I'm going to go around and I'm going to interview all the eyewitnesses and all the people that were there, and I'm going to write the biography of Jesus. And Paul decided he was going to sit down and he was going to write letters to all of the Christians all over the known world at the time that he had helped get gathered together to start these things that we call churches. They called ecclesias, or gatherings of Christians. And all of those things were already in existence for centuries before they became the Bible. But they were considered reliable enough to be included. You remember when you were in college and your literature professor said, I need you to go buy this $400 book, and it's a collection of short stories, and we're going to read like 4 of those short stories out of this huge book that's like that thick. Some of you are like, my college student right now is carrying around 4 of those, right? And you read a couple of those short stories and they were really good. What's amazing is what made the short story good was not the fact that it was included in the collection. Whoever was creating the collection decided it was good enough to be included. And this is how we come about the New Testament coming together. It was reliable. It passed the tests of certifiability. And what happens is the people that were closest to the authentic words of Jesus were considered to be authenticated. So they got included. It's a very different way. Again, it's not meant to take the Bible as not important. It's just helping us talk about it in a logical way and not just in this amorphous kind of way because that's what we've always heard at church. But to help people understand how we got to this place called the Bible. And then someone might go, yeah, but we don't know that those letters were actually written by those people at that time, and I want to help you navigate that conversation. So I need you to memorize a date. Don't worry, it's really easy to memorize. And aside from the birth and death of Jesus, I think this is the most important date in all of Christianity. Okay? Are you ready? So write this down. 70 A.D. is a huge date because it helps us understand actually when the New Testament things were written. So we're going to have a quick little history lesson that I find totally fascinating and amazing. So just after Jesus, there was what was called the First Jewish War. And it was the Jews kind of uprising and rebelling against Rome. Remember, Rome had kind of taken over the world, the empire, right? We think Empire Star Wars, think Empire Rome. And that's kind of how they behaved, though. They saw themselves in charge, and it was by brute force usually that they got people to submit to them and do what they wanted to do. But these little groups of Jews started rising up, and they were like fighting the system in a lot of ways. And so Rome decides, we've got to snuff this out. We've got to silence them. And they send Vespasian out to that area of the world to put an end to this. And he just starts taking city after city after city. I mean, we're talking about a huge military onslaught. And so Jewish city after Jewish city is eradicated until the Jews kind of end up all huddled in Jerusalem with the lock on the door. And the Romans are surrounding the city, and they come up with a whole thing as to how they're going to defeat and eventually get inside of Jerusalem. What happens is Vespasian ends up becoming the emperor, so he heads back off to the capital, and he puts his son Titus in charge of the effort now. And Titus is a strategist, but a scary one at that. And this is what he decides. We're going to starve them out. So we have the city surrounded. They're all huddled up in there. We're just going to make sure no food goes in. They've got a lot of food, but we can wait them out. And once they're out of food, they're going to want to come out here to get some, and we got them then, and we're certainly never going to send any in. And then they started just lining up crosses, just like Jesus died on crosses all around the perimeter of Jerusalem. And we know through history books, not the Bible, but other history books, that they crucified more than 500 Jews all around the perimeter of the city, just to intimidate them, just to scare them, just for them to be afraid. And eventually, hopefully, they would come out arms raised. But not so that Rome could take them as prisoners of war, but so that Rome could eradicate them and put them out. Eventually, what they do, and I'm summarizing a lot, you can go and read the full history. It's an amazing military story, actually. Titus they come up with a huge battering ram, and they end up what would be the word? Going through the wall. That's a better way to put it. They go through the wall with the battering ram, and they take the city, and they essentially burn it to the ground. And one of the things that they burn to the ground is the temple. So this is why 70 AD is so important. They burn the temple to the ground, which is the center of Judaism. Remember, everybody from all over the place, if you were a Jew, had to come into Jerusalem to visit the temple on a regular basis. Jesus himself would go into Jerusalem to go to the temple. The woman that was caught in adultery that was dragged before Jesus, that happened at the temple. So when the temple gets burned down, it's like Judaism is over. Like, that's it. This would have been a huge, huge moment in history for anybody that grew up in that region. This is what Josephus, he was a Jewish historian that was tight with the Roman officials, and he was around at that time. In fact, he saw it, and this is what he writes about the slaughter that happened in that place. The slaughter within was even more dreadful than the spectacle from without. Men and women, old and young, insurgents and priests, those who fought and those who entreated mercy were hewn down in indiscriminate carnage. The legionaries had to clamber over heaps of dead to carry on the work of extermination. This was horrific. This was so significant that you would not have existed in the world and not talked about it. And here's what's amazing. This moment appears 0 times in the New Testament. You don't read about it there. And I find that perplexing because all of the disciples, they grew up Jewish. And they would have gone into the temple several times. In fact, most of the story, the biography of Jesus happens in and around Jerusalem with the temple at the center of Jerusalem. And Paul would have gone in and out of there. I mean, he was a Pharisee. Paul never mentions the fall of Jerusalem. He never mentions the destruction of the temple. None of them do. And so I have to come to this conclusion, and this is why this is so important. The reason they don't mention it is because it hadn't happened yet. It hadn't happened yet. And right about now, you're going, what does this have to do with anything? Because it gives us confidence that what we read from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, James, Peter, and Paul was all written in a very specific time frame. Let me explain. Jesus was crucified in about AD 33. 32, 33, there's some discrepancies there, but it's not a huge deal. Just think 33 AD. That's when Jesus died and rose again and eventually ascended to be with his heavenly Father. The fall of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple happened when? 70 AD. Now, I'm not a math major, but I'm pretty sure that's about 37 years, right? Check me. 37 years between Jesus dying and resurrecting and the fall of Jerusalem. So everybody that wrote that never mentions the fall of Jerusalem, such a monumental, historic moment that no Jew could have even wrapped their mind around, if they wrote and they don't mention that, to me, they write in this time period, within 37 years, when all of the eyewitnesses to everything Jesus said and did were still alive. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever told a story about an event that happened, like when you were on vacation and you started stretching it a little bit, because you had to make it a little more juicy, you had to make it a little more interesting, and your spouse or your good friend looks at you and goes, that's not how it happened. Right? They caught you because they were there too. And there's no dispute. There's nobody coming along. As Luke is going around and he's interviewing all of these eyewitnesses that lived here, nobody's going, that's not how it happened. Everybody's going, that's exactly how it happened. And it's verified. And remember, Luke's a doctor. He would have fact-checked it all. And he would have put one person's interview up against another person's interview, against another person's interview, and they're all still alive. And these letters start getting circulated, and people start going, I'm giving my whole life to this resurrected Jesus. I'm putting my hope in him. It changes everything when we start thinking in terms of time and time frame. Now, here's what we know. Sociologists say it takes 80 to 90 years for a legend or a myth to take root and become like urban legends, something that a bunch of people believe. 80 to 90 years. You know why it takes that long? Because it takes that long for everybody to die that was there. Because you can't stretch the truth or make something up when you still have people walking around saying, I was there and it did or it did not go that way. So the reason these 37 years in between Jesus' death and the fall of Jerusalem are so important is because we know then that the eyewitnesses still were living and breathing. And the people that wrote the things that we read in the New Testament were still living and breathing. So it's not like somebody a few hundred years ago decided they were going to make something up. They never mentioned the fall of Jerusalem or the burning of the temple, so they must have written it before AD 70, which means they talked to people or were the people who were there. And if you're still not convinced, let me help you with an idea. If you were making something up and you were trying to buffalo a bunch of people into believing Jesus was more than just a person, I'm telling you, you are going to leverage, not avoid, you are going to leverage the fall of Jerusalem. And here's why. Because Jesus predicted it. And if you're trying to prove that he's awesome and amazing, you're going to go, see, he was right. Luke records Jesus making that prediction. It goes like this. Some of his disciples began talking about the majestic stonework of the temple and the memorial decorations on the walls. But Jesus said, the time is coming when all these things will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. Now, if Jesus says this, and then the fall of Jerusalem has happened, the next sentence for Luke should be, and that's exactly how it happened. And he would have done that because that's exactly what he did with Jesus predicting his own death and resurrection. He said, and then it happened. So Jesus is who he says he is. I would say, if Jesus said that, then I'm making sure. So I'm just convinced. It hadn't happened yet. And so we can have some certainty. And we can look at what we read in the New Testament as reliable because there were eyewitnesses that saw it all, that were a part of it all. And it is what took them from being afraid to being the most courageous Christians to ever live. Because saying these things out loud would get you killed or arrested. Just read Acts. Paul, several times in jail. Peter, in jail. Death threats, they threw rocks at these guys to try and kill them because they were saying Jesus was who he said he was, and he's not dead. He's alive. And so I just want to review, because I know this is a lot, and I want to give you just three real quick phrases that, again, I don't pretend answer all the questions that everybody's going to have, but they're going to help you bring the conversation to Jesus as quickly as possible, because remember, Jesus is our hope. And Peter says, be ready to explain your hope. So this is how I would navigate this kind of conversation. I take the Old Testament seriously because Jesus took it seriously. I know there's a lot of crazy stuff in there, and I don't have an answer for all that, and it doesn't all make sense to me either. But Jesus took it seriously, so I'm going to take it seriously because I follow Jesus. Whatever he says, I say. Whatever he does, I do. Whatever he believes, I believe. That's kind of the nature of being a disciple. So Jesus took the Old Testament seriously, so I take the Old Testament seriously. And then someone's go, well, why do you take Jesus seriously? I take Jesus seriously because of the resurrection. And boom, we're there. I take the Old Testament seriously because Jesus did, and I take Jesus seriously because of the resurrection. He said he was going to die and he was going to come back to life. That's exactly what he did. And Paul said if he didn't do that, then all of this is useless. So I take Jesus seriously because if you can predict your own death and resurrection and then pull it off, we go with whatever he says. Right? So I take Jesus seriously because of the resurrection. Well, why do you take the resurrection seriously? And here's my answer to that. I take the resurrection seriously because Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, we've had a whole conversation about James. What would it take for your sibling to convince you that they were your Lord? James and Paul took it seriously. The people that were there took it seriously enough to write it down to make sure that every generation of Jesus followers that ever existed would know. Took it seriously enough that they died horrific deaths for the sake of this truth. So I take Jesus and the resurrection seriously because Matthew said, and Mark said, and John said, and Luke said, and Peter said, and James said, and Paul said. And by the way, another note about Paul, he kind of hated Jesus and all Jesus followers for a real long time. And you know what changed his mind? A resurrected Jesus stopping him in his tracks on the way to Damascus. This is so important. This is so important because we live in a world of skepticism. If you're a high school student, good news is one day you're going to graduate. And you're going to go on to college. The bad news is a lot of the foundations of what you've just taken for granted and believed your whole life are going to get shook. And you need to know how to navigate that shaky ground. You need to know how to talk about that, and not just because the Bible told me so, but because Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and all those guys told me about the resurrection, which makes me take Jesus seriously, and who makes me take the Old Testament seriously. And have a logical conversation. You see, the truth is, one of the biggest misnomers about following Jesus is that you have to turn your brain off to do so. And I don't believe that for 1 second. In fact, Paul didn't either. He said, you're transformed by the renewing of your mind. So I don't think we need to turn our brains off. We actually need to apply our brains and think about this in a way that is conversational and gentle and respectful so that we can have real discussions about it. So you don't have to turn your brain off. You just have to be prepared to talk about the hope you have. You have to be prepared to talk about Jesus and anchoring him in the resurrection, the event that changed it all. Remember what we said last week. No one was at the tomb counting down. No one thought Jesus was going to do what he said he was going to do. They thought it was over. And they were hiding. And they weren't telling anybody that they had been with him. They weren't telling anybody that they were followers of the way. That was done. They were going to go back to their old life. But it was when Jesus showed up on the scene again after having died that everything changed. Everything changes when we anchor our hope to the resurrection.